Welcome to another episode of the CarryTrainer Higher Line podcast. Hey gang, welcome to another episode of the CarryTrainer Higher Line podcast. Quickly approaching number 100, somewhere in there. I think we're in the 70s now. I've got a buddy on here today. He's a professor. He's the tactical professor, Mr. Claude Werner. Thank you, sir.
Hey, glad to be here.
Now, just so people know, you're the tactical professor. In this day and age, people say, well, what the hell does that mean? So you were a U.S. Army Green Beret,
Yes.
right? You were an instructor for Rogers Shooting School.
Correct.
You've written volumes on this subject of human combat for years. What else have you done?
On a completely separate story, although running parallel, I used to be the National Director of Real Estate Research for the accounting firm Deloitte. So that has really influenced how I think about doing research and analysis and especially databasing incidents and information. Very helpful.
I think that's one of the things that I first found out about your work from was the databasing of actual shootings. You've compiled tons of data on that, correct?
Correct. I have over 5,000 incidents of private citizens and probably about 2,500 law enforcement encounters that they're actually in a database format that I plug things into when I find them, and I've been collecting that for over 20 years.
What kind of criteria are you looking for? So if I had an instance in my town and I was like, hey, I'm going to get this over to Claude, what are you looking for?
Anything that involves a defensive gun use, and that doesn't necessarily mean a shooting. I think of at least 4 different categories. Let's say the first one, the lowest level, is what I call armed encounters. So some guy tries to rob you and you just pull out a gun, and all of a sudden he looks at his watch and realizes it's time for a root canal, so he goes. That's an armed encounter. Somebody had a gun and you stopped it. Then there's a shooting in which one party shoots and the other party doesn't shoot, probably because they don't have a gun. And many of your burglaries and home invasions and things like that are shootings where there's someone in someone's home and the intruder is not necessarily armed with a firearm, but they're where they're not supposed to be, and depending on the state law, they're at that point are sort of chattel, the property of the homeowner, and so the homeowner shoots them. Well, that's a shooting. Only one side has a gun. Then a gunfight is both sides have guns and at least one side shoots.
Okay.
And then the final one that I think of is a gun battle. And those are typically law enforcement related, and that's where both sides have guns, both sides are shooting, and they're, in the military sense, they're decisively engaged either geographically or in many cases emotionally. So let's say, for instance, the Newhall massacre and the Miami massacre, those were gun battles in that the criminals, even though they had the opportunity to escape, did not do so, and they continued the fight. There gets to be that point where the emotions have overwhelmed one or both sides, and they're just not going to leave, even if they could. So any of those type of things are the things that I categorize. Obviously, the gunfights and gun battles tend to be more law enforcement oriented, although not necessarily. I've got a couple of gun battles between feuding families, which tend to go back earlier times in the previous century. But in some cases, those were gun battles where they're just not going to give up until the other side is dead. And there are a fair amount of gunfights that take place in the private sector as well. But shootings, are common. They happen every day, and it aggravates me when gun control people say, "Oh, this would never happen." Do you read your newspaper? They happen all the time, and justifiably so. Person here in Georgia, when is in your home, they are presumptively there legally to cause violence, and so you can visit violence back on them, including using deadly force to prevent them from doing anything there in the house. So,
meaning to the person listening, this is something that comes up often in our classes. A lot of folks think they have to wait till they're shot or stabbed or bludgeoned or whatever the mode of injury might be before they can use some action against somebody. But in your state, your legislators define that if somebody decides to break into your home, we're presuming they're there for evil intentions, right?
Right. That it's just our case law of castle doctrine goes back well over 100 years in this state.
Okay.
Finally, I believe it was 2007, the legislature codified it into statutory law, but it's existed for a long, long time here. Okay. And when someone comes into your house, we just assume that they're there, for no good reasons beyond just a property crime.
Because a normal, rational, law-abiding citizen doesn't just enter into somebody's domicile uninvited, right?
Kind of right, exactly. And there are unfortunate incidents where, it's an innocent party.
Drunk person walking into the wrong house.
Right. We had a very unfortunate incident a few years ago where there was an elderly man who had Alzheimer's disease and had gotten out of his house and was miles away from his own home.
Oh no!
And the boyfriend of the homeowner shot and killed him. Which was it was really unfortunate, and it's an example of why there's a section of one of my books where I talk about how to practice with using a flashlight, and I give that away free, just so people understand that I'm a firm believer that, especially at night, but not necessarily at night, when you pick up a gun at home, the first thing you should pick up is a flashlight. Then pick up your gun, and we have to identify our target before shooting. Every week, literally every week, I document an example of a family member or someone who is, not even like this, an Alzheimer's patient, but perhaps a neighbor or something like that who gets shot by a homeowner, and it was utterly unnecessarily, even when it's legal.
Just had that wife die on the 12th in Michigan.
Okay.
They thought the house was being burglarized earlier in the evening, so the husband was all keyed up, went to bed, and a couple hours later he heard some commotion and shot, and it was his wife. He shot her in the chest and killed her. 30-year-old male, 31-year-old female, 4-year-old called 911, said mommy's not breathing. It's horrible. Actually, I talked to one of the deputies there in that county, and totally tragic. He was keyed up from the earlier fear of a break-in and thought his wife was still laying next to him. She was up moving about.
I see that and read that and hear that more often than you can imagine. I thought my wife was laying in bed next to me.
Yeah.
It just, we cannot make that assumption. I don't know how that happens. You reach over and it's the comforter that's bunched up or something. I just don't know, but it happens on a regular basis, and that's why I'm just a big believer. You have to have a flashlight. You have to identify people before you shoot them. If we want to be called the good guys, we have to act like the good guys.
Mm-hmm.
And that means our default is that we have to know exactly what we're doing before we start shooting someone, even in our own home.
Yeah, the excuse of I was scared or made a wrong decision based on my emotions or adrenaline doesn't cut it when you shoot your loved one. Or that law enforcement officer that just got shot in Texas. I actually got a phone call from somebody in that town because we shared some information on that. And it wasn't to insult the guy, the homeowner. Alarm went off, and the guy was kind of a big shot oil tycoon, nice house.
Mm-hmm.
Alarm went off. The police came. The door was slightly ajar. So law enforcement officers thought, okay, somebody's breached the door of this house. We got a family inside. We got to go in. And he announced his presence. Cops are here coming in. And as the door opened, the homeowner shot him and killed him.
Right.
Auditory exclusion, I don't know. But I got a phone call, said you're like us sharing that information was ruining that man's life. And I said, hey, man, for the public good, people need to hear about this stuff. It's in the news. Of course, I'm not trying to injure that man's reputation any more than it is. But like you said, his stuff just happens so much.
And his life is ruined anyway.
Yeah.
When somebody shoots their wife or their child or a close friend or a neighbor, their life is ruined anyway. So it's not like we're being heartless. We're trying to make sure that that doesn't happen to other people.
Yeah.
When we talk about this sort of thing.
Yeah. Claude, before we started recording, you told me, you said, hey, I've got a topic that I'd like to talk about.
Mission, roles, and definition of success. And this had came up, oddly enough, in a discussion about pepper spray. And it just, the discussion got me to thinking about, which I do a lot. As you mentioned earlier, I'm a retired military officer. So the whole concept of mission is extremely important to me. And if you think about it, there are 4 different groups of armed people in our nation. We have the military, we have law enforcement, we have private security, and then we have armed citizens. And the mission statements for all of those groups are different. Mm-hmm. And the roles that they play are all different. Sometimes they overlap, but they're all essentially different. And then the definitions of success that we have are frequently radically different. Let's say the definition of success for a law enforcement officer is to get the bracelets on a criminal and take the criminal into custody. Definition of success for a private citizen is to not get hurt and not have a family member hurt. So if in our case as private citizens, if we produce a gun and if we shoot it or not, and the criminal runs off and gets out of our life or allows us to run and get out of his life, that's a success.
Right.
But to a law enforcement officer, or even in some cases to a private security officer, that's a failure.
Right. He can't run back to the station and say, oh, thank God I won this one. I ran away.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, that is a problem when the training industry started overlapping between law enforcement and the private sector, both security and private citizens, because the use of force is somewhat similar, but its objectives can be very different. And so, we kind of confuse those differing roles. And I think that's important for us as armed private citizens to think about the fact that our role is very different. One of my categories of negative outcomes is I have 11 of them with a few subcategories within them, but one of them is intervention, and where people sometimes think that because they have a gun, they're not exactly police, but as one lady put it, I just wanted to help. Well, in cases, our help is neither desired nor necessary.
Yeah.
And there was a great quote from Clint Smith not too long ago that the guy's going to get out on bail in a few days anyway. So who cares? It's not important that we take people into custody. Our mission is just to not get hurt and not have our loved ones get hurt.
That's kind of become my mantra the last 4 or 5 years, talking about the overlap of training. I train predominantly armed citizens, but maybe 20-25% of them are law enforcement officers. And at the beginning of every course, I hand out a piece of paper, and it's got 3 sentences with some lines underneath each sentence. And the first sentence says, "Why are you here?" And the second one says, like, what is a definable metric of success for your time with me? What does that look like? And we talk about that. I'll go around a group, and it's not to feel good or anything like that. It's to, somebody will say things like, "Oh, I'm training because I want to be faster." Well, what does that look like? What does that mean? You want to shoot a flying gnat 500 yards away with your pistol, or do you want to shoot a balloon 2 feet away? And in what time frame? And what's the condition of ready? Are you at low ready? Are you holstered? And you from Rogers Shooting School, you guys have quantified that to a crazy amount of science. But I've sat as a student in dozens of classes where instructors have told the students, regardless of their profession or oath or duty, if you're armed in public, you have a duty to protect the public. And it's like, no, I don't. If I'm with my kids or my wife, my number one job is to take them away. And even if they're not with me, my number one job is to show up at home. Does that make me less of a human or less of an American to choose my family over yours? Or
right,
something?
Exactly. That is exactly true. And people just don't seem to understand that at times.
Yeah. Now, I've heard people say, well, I had a friend who will say to me, "I just can't reconcile that you wouldn't do something." Well, I didn't say I wouldn't. I'm just not saying I will no matter what, because I can.
There's a very smart attorney named Steve Harris in Florida. He writes on the Modern Service Weapons blog. And he came up with a paradigm that I really like: can, may, should, and must. Can you do it being the physical ability? If you can't, if you lack the requisite skill to engage a target, then you simply can't do it. Then the may is the legal part. The should is then the judgment call, and the must is, I have to do this to go home to my family or to prevent my family from being hurt. Well, there's another fellow named Lee Weems, chief deputy of Oconee County here in Georgia, who a few weeks ago put on a class called Standing Your Ground. Chief Weems is a pretty smart guy. And he had taken Steve Harris's protocol or paradigm, and he said the must is fairly clear cut if you look at things in a rational way from the reasonable man point of view, as the law would express it. He goes, the should part is a moral judgment that, he goes, I cannot make that for you. And I love the way he expressed that. Should I do that? And any intervention on the part of a third party other than your family or close friends or whatever, that's now become a should. And it's a moral judgment that people have to make on their own. And your sense of morals and mine are different from everybody else's. Everybody has a unique sense of moral judgments. And I've been taken to task at times by people who were expressed a great deal of umbrage when they said, well, if you see my daughter being raped, you mean you won't intervene? And I said, well, first of all, I don't know it's your daughter. I only know you on the internet. I have no idea what your daughter even looks like.
I'm not laughing about somebody being raped for those listening.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But I don't know you, and I don't know what the circumstances are. For all I know, that's a law enforcement officer trying to get the bracelets on somebody who's doing something that they shouldn't have been doing. And women do have that ability to say something is rape that men generally don't, except on a very limited set of circumstances, when it might in fact not be that at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so and it gives us an idea of the difficulty that law enforcement officers have when they arrive on a scene. They don't know who anybody is.
Yeah.
Now, if we were being attacked, you or I would know, okay, we're the good guy. We're the harmless party in this. We didn't do anything. And some guy stepped out of the shadows and pulled a gun on us and said that he wants our wallet. That's fairly clear to us who was the good and the bad there. On the other hand, let's say that guy's got a gun and we pull out a gun and it's a Mexican standoff. And a law enforcement officer arrives. How does he know who is who?
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't.
Or another good Samaritan walks through the door of said building and.
Exactly. So anytime we intervene, we are now in that same set of circumstances of we don't really know exactly what's going on. And that saying of fools rush in where angels fear to tread starts to apply. So that then becomes that should intervention. Now, there's probably some things that we could make a fairly clear judgment. We're in a convenience store, the clerk is being robbed, and the robber says, get on your knees, and it's pretty obvious he's going to execute the person who's the clerk. Well, that we can probably make a fairly good judgment call on what is happening. Now, once again, even to what extent we're going to intervene on their behalf remains to be seen. But at least we know who the good guy and the bad guy is in that circumstances. But that is not always particularly clear. And I think that people who have this idea that they want to go out and get a license to carry, as we call it here in Georgia, and then they think that's going to make them into a police, they're cruising for bruising, as we used to say in Chicago. It's just, you have to really think about whether this is a worthwhile effort, even if it's nothing more than the fact that there is a shooting that's completely justifiable, but you're probably going to get arrested as a result of that.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't want to spend some time in jail, that means that you're going to have to engage a bail bondsman to get you out of jail. Well, that's going to cost the first year of your child's college tuition to get that bail bondsman to get you out of jail. And something that a lot of people don't seem to understand is the bail gets returned to the bail bondsman, but the bail bondsman does not get his fee, or her fee does not get returned to the party who got released from jail. That's just their fee for having gotten you out so that you didn't have to worry about dropping the soap when you were in the shower.
Sure.
So people don't seem to understand that reality. Even if the district attorney said the next day, okay, that's great. It's very clear from the video evidence that you were in the right and everything. Your $15,000 or $20,000, $25,000 bail bondsman fee is gone.
Mm-hmm.
That's just gone. And so to who do you owe that obligation? To your child to get them through your college, or to a clerk in the convenience store? Once again, as Lee said, that's a moral judgment. I can't tell you what to do about that.
And this is why you hear folks say, well, I couldn't live with myself. You might not be able to. I can, or she can, or he can. That's like you said. I tend to start with folks that are having a hard time wrapping their head around this with with this what's your goal discussion. And I always come back to, or maybe start at, for me, my goal is to live a long, full life.
Mm-hmm. A worthy goal, I might add.
Yeah, I want to live a long, full life. And full to me means happy, right? And I'm not happy if I'm in jail. I'm not happy if I'm shot up. I'm not happy if my kids are dead or wife is dead. So my goal is to keep everybody else around me alive and well. And so like then that to me, and this is just me talking like with people that have this discussion and not wrap their head around it, my actions should support all that.
Right.
Rushing into danger in the convenience store, being the good guy, support my kids living a long, full life? Does it support my wife still having a husband? Does it support? And like you said, I think for some people, yourself and myself included, I tend to hope I would do something to be of value to somebody in that circumstance. But quick side story, I got a phone call last year from a student of mine, friend, young man, and he's out of breath. And it's like, I've told this story a few times on these podcasts just because it's so relevant to what we're talking about. And I said, what's going on, man? It was like 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and it was around the holidays. It was Black Friday after Thanksgiving. And he said, I'm in the mall and there's a shooting. And I'm like, right now? Like, why are you on the phone with me? Like, and I can hear all kinds of commotion behind him in the mall. And he's like, what should I do? And I said, well, leave, leave. Right. Get out, find a door, leave, go through a store. I'm telling him, behind the stores, there's usually hallways or at least an emergency exit, leave or barricade yourself somewhere. I said, who's with you? And he's got his mom, his aunt, his girlfriend. He's got like 4 or 5 women he's taken shopping.
Wow.
So you clearly have to huddle them up and get moving. And my truck's on the other side of the parking lot. Who cares? Walk out into the night and go find an IHOP or something and post up until the police secure the thing, or get an Uber, go home. Your truck will be in the parking lot. It turns out it was a very tragic event. The gentleman that ended up trying to save the day, very pertinent to this story, was a good guy trying to stop a bad guy that ended up shot. And didn't identify himself. People didn't know who he was, etc. But this, of course, gunshots in a crowded mall just caused a complete melee. But I talked to this guy later. I said, well, so you're going to come up with a plan next time before you go to the mall and wait for gunfire, and that was just so telling to me of how little people think about this stuff. But he was armed, and in his head, as he leaves the house every day, he's the guy that's ready for trouble because he's got that blaster in his pocket. But in reality, he wasn't prepared whatsoever.
Yeah, when we're not prepared to make decisions ahead of time, our decisions in the moment are frequently not very good. And I talk a lot about what I call Boyd's process. People refer to it as the OODA loop.
You're talking about John Boyd.
John Boyd.
Yeah.
And Boyd's process is very heavily primed, if you look at it, in the orient phase. And the orient phase includes an awful lot of pre-made decision making. This is something I used to be amazed when I would watch there was an old show years ago called Dogfights. And they would talk, the pilots would talk about all these dogfights they were in, especially the jet fighter pilots. And, this Sam was coming up at me, and I'm in a vertical climb doing a corkscrew with a MiG-17 and this and that. And I'm thinking, how does this guy make these decisions so fast? And then after I started studying Boyd's process, I thought, he's not making the decisions. He's merely choosing a decision from an array of options that he's already made. And that's how he does it. There's a lot of foolishness around Boyd's process where people think it's thinking faster. Well, short of being augmented with chemical substances, you're not going to think any faster than you can ordinarily. That's just not the way our physiology works. But if you have already made decisions that you can just pick from an array of options, that you can do much faster than try to make up a plan on the spot. And when people just have a tool, a gun, and they don't think about, well, what's the circumstances that I would employ this or not employ it, or get the hell out of there, something like that, then what they've done is they've deprived themselves of a big part of the usefulness of the tool. And I try to tell people that the value of the tool is its ability to implement the decisions that we've already made. And a lot of people don't seem to understand that. And a lot of that's because in our lives, we generally don't have to make life and death decisions. And so people just aren't used to that idea. And your technique of asking a question ahead of time at the very beginning of training is a really good way of doing that, of clarifying, well, what are your goals in this whole thing? Because then you can start making your decisions ahead of time as opposed to trying to make them up in the moment, which sometimes, in many cases, they'll work out. As long as it's a clear-cut thing, the guy steps out of the alleyway and he's threatening you with a weapon and wanting your wallet. Well, that's not that hard of a decision to make. It's either, do I run and get away from him, or do I give in, or do I fight him? But when you get into ambiguous circumstances, like you just described, I'm in a mall, I've got a bunch of people with me, there's shooting going on over there, what do I do about that? That's a more complex decision that it's useful to have at least thought about what your possible options are ahead of time. And like you said, so my vehicle's on the other side of the parking lot. Who cares? I'm just gonna get it. If it's nothing else, and I'm gonna go to one of those trees out by the parking lot as a rally and get my family members there and make sure I've got them all. And then we'll just wait for the cops to show up. And when the blue lights leave, then I know I can walk over to the other side of the mall. Good enough. That's all we care about. Yeah,
it's not so cut and dry as a pack of wolves cornering you in a valley or something. It's
exactly
got some which it's like I like to go with this, what my goal is, because running towards that sound with my aunt and grandma probably doesn't support my goal of taking them home safely like when we left. So I'm going to go that way. Like, it's pretty simple. I'm going to go back to Boyd's process. I went deep into a rabbit hole, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years ago and studied everything I could on him. And it's amazing how the training community, of course, this, but for people listening, this concept of Boyd's OODA loop has been so minimalized and marginalized for what it was. Like, I think it took him like several days to give the actual brief on this.
Yes.
And now people explain it with a cute diagram in like 3 minutes. And it's like, no, it took him days to sit and give this discussion. And like, I like to think about, just so people listening understand kind of what you're talking about that haven't invested energy in it. Like, on a sports analogy, I've got a friend that's really into sports science, and you understand the processing speeds us humans have, eyes and ears and our senses. They're talking about a major league batter possibly has less than 1/10 of a second to decide whether or not he's going to swing at a pitch. So much data that he's taking in, and a lot of it is his brain already has seen it so many times. And he may not even know what he's seeing, but the parts of his brain that recognize it do. Okay, that pitcher is going to throw a curveball or whatever. I don't know. And they decide sometimes before the ball ever even leaves the hand. They know what's up from seeing it so many times. So that's like the super high speed end, but then like driving a car in traffic, you don't need to tell yourself how to turn the turn signal on or apply brake or clutch or gas. Like I'm just talking about on a subconscious level.
Right, exactly.
So then we got to add in this. Now I've got an icy patch or something's running the road. What have you done to have the skills to operate your car when that patch of ice comes, or the deer runs out in front of you, or the proverbial kid with the ball? I bring this up because as you touched on that, it made me think of how this training world that we now have has done such a good job of chopping up people's good work into meaningless bites.
It's unfortunate because a lot of this is really good material, but unfortunately, our brains can only process so much at a time. And that's one reason why from the standpoint of the training perspective, I don't believe in the force feeding with a fire hose concept that I hear some trainers talk about, simply because people cannot absorb that. In training, I said this at the Mingle, which is a ladies only invitational event. Occurs every year. Shelley Hill sponsors it here in Atlanta through the Complete Combatant. And last year I was the featured speaker. And my comment that really apparently resonated with the audience was, training is not a destination, it's a journey. And I would further say that practice, and you alluded to this with the baseball player. How many times has a baseball player who's a good, 300 hitter, how many times has that baseball player had a ball thrown across the plate for him or her to swing at?
Yeah.
Many, many times. And so we have to think about this in terms of that people get this unusual idea, well, perhaps not unusual, but false idea that I'm going to go to a training course and then I'm trained. I know what I need to know. Where in fact, I'm a firm believer of, in Eckathorn's philosophy, the purpose of training is to teach you what to practice after the class.
Right on.
And I feel like not only that, but it's to raise the questions in people's minds. I often tell people, you're going to find this class of mine aggravating because I'm not going to give you any answers. I'm going to give you a bunch of questions that you're going to have to answer later.
I would demand a refund.
I will give you an array of possible answers, but once again, we're in the should when it comes to decision making. What is your moral compass? And I can't say that, but I think one thing that people who have weapons, and even people who don't have weapons, they have to think about the fact that by making their decisions ahead of time and then practicing those decisions, even if it's only in their mind, you see a set of circumstances. I had an unusual thing happen to me, I don't know, about 2 months ago, where I'd gone over to Office Despot to make some copies. And it's like, 4:30 in the afternoon on Friday. And there's a car sitting there by one of the islands with a tree. And there's a woman and a young girl with her. And I said, well, are you so poor that you have no place to go play on Friday afternoon except the Office Despot parking lot? And then I came out and they were gone. But the car had been replaced by another one, a very similar set of circumstances. And then that's when I realized it was a prisoner exchange. This is, formerly married couples exchanging their kids, and they use that as neutral ground. Okay, well, I think we have to accept the fact that at times domestic violence occurs in those. Matter of fact, I know it does, because it wasn't a week after that I read about a shooting that occurred at another prisoner exchange.
Oh, wow.
And
for the listeners, this is Claude's sense of humor. He's talking children of divorced parents getting carted back and forth.
Yes, exactly. To me, that's a prisoner exchange.
Yeah.
So, well, too much time thinking about Checkpoint Charlie during the Cold War.
Right.
But at any rate, so that raises the question then, what am I willing to do if some episode of domestic violence breaks out? Because I was actually sitting there drinking my delicious strawberry milkshake from Steak and Shake. Because I thought, well, Steak and, I don't know if you're familiar with Steak and Shake, but their shakes are real thick. And I bought it and driven over to Office Despot, and I figured, well, I'll go in, I'll make my copies, and by the time I come out, it will have thawed out enough that I can drink it. So I was just planning on drinking it there in the parking lot, but as I'm drinking my shake, I'm looking at this thing going, well, what if domestic violence breaks out? Well, I had to think about that ahead of time, and I still don't really know for sure what I would do, but at least I had some thoughts about what some possible actions on my part, one of which might have been to just sit there and get my cell phone out and say, hey, 911, there's some problem going off here in the parking lot, and maybe you should send an officer over here to do something about it. But thinking about those kind of things ahead of time, and then even if all I've done is thought about it, it ceases to be a novel event. And that's one of the things that we do in our training and our practice, is try to reduce the novelty of the various events that we see, so we're not stunned by them when they happen.
Makes good sense. That's one of those discussions. I'll have people send me questions like, I got one the other day. Hey, Mick, my wife is traveling, so I'm taking my two boys for like a weekend getaway. And they're this age and this age. What do I do if trouble comes? And I was like, are you serious? Like, we could talk till our lives end in 40 years and never cover every possible, eventuality of what could happen with your kids. Like, kind of coming back to the practice versus training thing, and whether you should or shouldn't do things. Like, it always depends.
Right?
It just depends. I tell a story, listeners have probably heard me say years ago, my wife and I were driving in a blizzard back to her house to get something. And it was like Christmas holiday, and she's coming back to my place. We're going to watch a movie, and we went to her house to grab something, and just a total Chicago blizzard. Snow's falling, and with the headlights, it's hard to see. And I pull out of her neighborhood, and the streets are dead. I'm the only guy driving. And in the headlights, I see a bunch of guys fighting in the middle of the street. I'm like, what?
Great. Yeah.
So I stop like 100 feet back and just kind of watch for a minute. What am I seeing? And all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, there's two guys beating up a man in a wheelchair. So I tell Sharon, my wife, I said, call the cops. And I grab, at the time, I had a real bright flashlight on me, and I opened the door up and I stuck my head out and I said, hey, let him go. And as I say that, I hear somebody screaming, bloody murder, help me, help me, help me. So I just told her, call the cops. I jumped out and sprinted through the snow. And as I get closer, I'm ready. I'm like, all right, I'm fighting two dudes. Here we go. The fact was, the guy in the wheelchair's beating the crap out of the two guys. He's holding them. His arms are so strong from a life of having to propel himself with his arms that he's banging these guys' heads together. And he's got good footing. His wheels, rubber wheels, are not slipping in the snow, and he's got the chair locked out. And he's used to balancing like this. These guys are slipping all over in the snow, and he's slamming their heads together, literally.
Wow.
So, completely opposite of what I assumed had I run up and just started shooting or punching or, baseball batting somebody. And I tell this guy, a couple seconds elapse, and I see what's happening in amazement. I'm like, hey, man, let him go. And he drops them and they fall in the snow. He thumped them to the point that they were almost unconscious, slamming them together. And they're one of them's crying. They're all drunk friends that were out going somewhere, and they got in an argument, and he beat the hell out of these two guys. I mean, they were bloodied up, but like our perception in my brain, kind of like the baseball player, this can't be right. They're beating up a person with a disability because this guy in a wheelchair is not beating two people up. And I'm glad that I didn't drive up there and just, go to town on them, but things are not always as they seem. And
that's right. They're just not. And we have to be very cautious about making our set of assumptions. And in some cases, the best thing to do is exactly what you did, where you closed the gap, but you didn't jump in right away and just saw, stopped a little bit short of it and saw what was happening, and then said, well, at this point, the situation is a little different than what I thought about it was from 100 feet away. From 12 feet away, it doesn't look quite the same. And that's our sense of geography of the science of proxemics.
That's a big word.
Yeah, how we use space. There are definitive boundaries for that.
How the hell do you even spell that?
Proxemics, proxemics.
I got it right. I'm going to look that up. I like new words.
Well, and it's a science developed by a professor of social anthropology about how humans use space. And he actually his book is called The Hidden Dimension. His name is Dr. I've got it sitting right here on my desk, Dr. Edward Hall. It answered a lot of questions that I had about my gunfight database that I just did not quite understand. Why do people hesitate to shoot until the criminal is just a little bit past arm's length? I didn't quite understand that. Well, Dr. Hall's work made it very clear that in North America, we have zones of space, and our personal space extends out from us 4 feet. And then from 4 feet until 12 feet is what he calls social space, and beyond 12 feet is public space. Well, as strange as it sounds, shooting someone is a social interaction. And so therefore it tends to occur in social space. Now, think about those numbers. Social space ends at 12 feet and public space starts at 12 feet. Think about the Tueller principle, 21 feet. Well, public space means that barring something to the contrary that we're aware of, we assume that anybody in public space has the right to be there. So unfortunately, at 12 feet, we start thinking people have the right to be there. But according to the Tueller principle, somewhere around, take your pick, 20 feet to 30 feet, that's the point where they can aggress on us if they choose to do so very rapidly, which doesn't happen as often as people would like to think, but it could. So at any rate, that's why...
That's where that may or should I come in.
Right, exactly. Well, it's one consideration of it at any rate. But at some point, the must will then occur within that 4 to 12 feet. And actually, Dr. Hall broke it down between what he called the near phase and the far phase. And the boundary line between those is 7 feet. And what it seemed to me in many of these incidents is that when the criminal just broke that barrier, that 7-foot barrier between the near and far phase of social space, that's when the shooting occurred. And it just answered an awful lot of my questions, because I went, now this all makes sense about why I was seeing, which I couldn't understand. Paul Gomez, the late Paul Gomez, a colleague of mine, very smart guy. He said, people just don't shoot criminals far enough away. And that's why. After I discovered Dr. Hall's work after Paul passed away, and that made it very clear to me why that was the case. So
this is kind of just bred into us, this understanding of distances and such, which is, yeah. Did you just put something online about? I think you did. Hamburger with legs. You talked about
right. The two-legged cheeseburger.
Yeah. You were talking about some ladies that were totally unaware while you were at the checkout, and that made me think. It's not even from like a protective standpoint for me. It's just manners. Like if I'm at the checkout, I let the person in front of me finish their business before I approach the counter, because the credit cards and all that stuff, just to give them room to finish their business. And then when it's my turn, if somebody steps up and they're sitting there with their stuff like 6 inches from you, it's like, I think like I'm not a weirdo. Like I hug men, I can touch people, but in this situation, it's like it annoys me. Back the heck up, why?
Exactly. You don't want them within 4 feet of you. That's kind of the deal. And I like the way you said that about manners, because one of the things that annoys me, strictly from the standpoint of my father taught me to be a mannerly gentleman. And
thank you for putting the tie on, by the way. I feel way underdressed.
I'm notorious for this. I made a DVD with Rob Pincus one time, and I showed up in a coat and a tie, and he looked at me and he said, "I'm speechless." And he didn't say anything. And then the guy whose range we were at goes, "I'm a witness. You rendered Rob Pincus speechless. It's probably the first time in his life." So yeah, I like the tie. But at any rate, just the way we interact with people, I prefer to interact with a cashier like a normal human being. They're not a kiosk yet. They will be eventually, but for right now, it's a human being. Hey, I'm not going to be, carrying on a conversation with somebody else. And you see this all the time where people are talking on their cell phone and they treat the cashier like a piece of machinery. Well, that's a human being. Just, can you not get off your phone for 1 minute to pay your thing and get your receipt? And then if you want to start talking again, go ahead. But from my perspective, why don't you wait until you've gotten out to your car, you've got your car started, you pull out of the parking space and get yourself on the way. And then if you want to start talking again, start talking. As opposed to, I've seen at least 2 crashes in parking lots where people were talking on their phone and they would just back out of the parking spot into somebody who was driving by. They were totally in the wrong.
The myth of multitasking.
Yeah, that's it. Learn to shut up.
I'm guilty of it all the time, not just the cell phones, but I just was talking to somebody earlier. I was at the range this morning and I forgot a piece of gear in the truck. And I said, I'll go grab it. And I picked up my phone and walked towards the door to go outside to the truck. And in the interim, I looked at an email, got to my truck, stared in the truck. Why the hell am I out here? Went back in. and then when I got back into the table with my gear on it, I was like, shit, and turned around and went right back out again. Right. I told myself, one at a time, one thing at a time.
That's it. And that's something that, and it's a good example of how tools direct our focus. Your cell phone, your gun, your vehicle, and we need to be cautious about the fact and aware of that fact that the tools tend to focus us in some cases away from the set of circumstances. And you just gave a perfect example of that. Yeah, I was going to do something and my tool, my cell phone, distracted me from doing it, and I completely forgot what I was supposed to do. And then I went back and I have to redo the thing that I set out to do originally. Well, that occurs with guns too. And that's why we need to learn to be proficient with our tools. And I have come to take a different philosophy of that I won't say completely different, but somewhat different than when I was at the Elite Roger Shooting School, that I'm less concerned with marksmanship than I am with very pristine gun handling. You know, it's
man.
The marksmanship problem that we will face is generally not particularly difficult. If Bill Rogers, I'm glad to know Bill Rogers does not listen to podcasts, because he'd be horrified if he heard me say this, that the standard that I think people should initially go for is the ability to hit a piece of paper in landscape mode at 12 feet. That's if you can do that, then you can probably solve your problem. But you also have to do that with, I've identified at least 35 tasks that are associated with personal protection. Oddly enough, reloading is so low on a priority list that I don't even emphasize it when I do teach classes anymore. I'm just not concerned about it. Really, a much more important task than reloading is the ability to move with the gun in your hand without having negligent discharge. And when people say that competitions do not provide any training value, oh no, that's not true at all. Because both in IDPA and USPSA and ICOR, any number of sports, shooting sports, you learn to move with the gun without having a negligent discharge. Because if you think about it, in many home invasions, what happens? One person has to go to another part of the house, because most people don't carry guns around in their pocket. They just don't do that. So let's get that out of our head as something that people are going to do. So that means when a home invasion occurs, assuming it's during some kind of hours before they've gone to bed, they're going to have to go somewhere, probably to the bedroom, or maybe, an office or something like that, where they store their gun. They're going to have to access the gun. In many cases, that gun will be chamber empty, so they're going to have to load the gun. Then they're going to have to move back to the point where the intruder is with the gun in hand, not menace their family members while they're moving, and not have a negligent discharge. And then at some standoff distance from the home invader, perhaps start shooting. That's a whole different set of skills than you learn at an indoor range. And almost none of them are particularly marksmanship oriented.
I couldn't agree more with you. I'm going to add two things. So one, it's good to hear somebody with your level of expertise validate what we've been teaching. I'll catch some flack from people. I'm very regimented. I'm a tradesman by profession. I've spent 20 plus years of my life building things, and I've only invested about 10 in this. But I've seen people cut fingers off and fall off ladders and do all of those things. And I never had an injury like that, besides, maybe cutting myself with a knife or something a few times in my life. Because I always understood if I use the thing a certain way, it'll never hurt me,
right,
or I'll never hurt myself. So I have a lot of folks on social media. I'm kind of known as the guy to make fun of about press checks. And I would never tell somebody to press check a gun unless they needed to press check a gun. But we teach a process like the Army teaches, or like a lot of other people, how to load a weapon, right? Like lock the slide, give it a visual inspection, seat lock, tug, cycle, press check, make sure the slide's in battery, safely holster with your finger off the trigger, and unload, in a similar fashion. And the thing I try to get people to understand, and of course this isn't for you, it's for the listeners or viewers, is that process is removing the highest chance or probability of you injuring yourself, or of course the whole time you're minding the muzzle and trigger, but it's removing chances of injury and a chance of you putting the gun in your holster without it being loaded, or casing it with it loaded when you intended to unload. It's just a process that gives you a very measured result. And so, like, I hone that during our courses, not just the loading, but the whole process of how you interact with the gun. But we do a lot of shooting and moving. So by the time we're like 4 or 5 hours into a class, we're advancing and falling back from targets, or maybe traversing some barrels like in a zigzag fashion, not as a tactic, but just to get comfortable moving. And I have people bend down and pick up magazines
right.
with their gun out. You know,
Mhm.
you bend down and pick that up without pointing it where you shouldn't. And people have watched or engaged in it, and they're like, I don't get it. Well, you don't, because the outcome isn't to be good at shooting at the range. The outcome is to be really good where you can proficiently run through a mall with your gun out or whatever.
Right. Right.
Go to your kid's bedroom and collect him without shooting him errantly.
Right. Having an ND in your own home. You know, that's probably, there's people often talk about the worst possible case. You know, and the worst possible case, as many people think about it, they think about like some guy who's on crack that doesn't feel any pain and they have to shoot him 27 times and you know, their gun is only a 13 rounder, so they don't have enough ammo and so forth. No, I've identified at least 7 now, worst possible cases, and worrying about that guy that can soak up 27 million rounds of ammunition. You know, you could shoot him with a minigun and he won't fall down.
Sure.
That's way down on the list. What's worst possible case? Well, shooting your wife when you think it's an intruder or your kid, or thinking that you're something is legal and you go to New York City and go to the Statue of Liberty and you see there's a metal detector there. So you go up to the cop and say, officer, I have a concealed carry license from the state of Tennessee and I have a gun on me. What do I do? And the officer says, okay, well, let me have your gun. Okay, now put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest. And like $10,000, and 3 years later, they let you plead that down to some misdemeanor so that, you know, you don't lose your gun rights. Well, that's a worst possible case. Or, you know, I came up, you know, one of the memes that I hate is I'd rather be tried by 12 than carried by 6.
Sure.
Okay. So worst possible case, being carried by 6 or spending the rest of your natural life in prison being raped several times a week by multiple bad guys in prison, you know, for 20, which I worked it out as like over 25 years, 3,900 times, which is worse. I don't know. That's a moral judgment, you know. I don't know. But there's a lot of worst possible cases. And I think that we need to, as a community, not just us as trainers, but as a community, need to discard this idea that the worst possible case is just this guy that, you know, soaks up an enormous amount of ammunition. Because, and then they'll cite something like the Miami massacre. Okay, great. That occurred
34
years ago now. And granted, it was pretty bad, but that is so far down on the list of probabilities.
It's like me armoring my house against meteor strikes.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the things that I use as an example. I say, do you walk down the street with a Kevlar helmet on in case a meteorite comes down and hits you in the head?
I thought
Probably
you were
not.
smarter than that, dude. If you got hit by a meteor, even with the Kevlar on, it would compress your spine and still so you need more than just a helmet.
Yeah.
Some professor. That's just a joke. That's an interesting, like your job at Rogers or many high level shooting courses like that, high volume, high level of competency required to do well. Nothing wrong with any of it. And it's only going to make somebody better at protecting themselves. But I think the point you're driving at is for average Joe, that's not really the problem that needs solving. You don't have to be a master class or grandmaster shooter. And we're not looking at the problem correctly. It's like we've lost the context of what the whole notion is of why we're trying to. Are we going to karate class because we want a belt, or are we going to karate class because we want to get better at not getting beaten up by bullies?
Well, and you just mentioned a thing that I think is really important to think about the context of it. And that goes back to our initial statement at the beginning of our talk about what's our mission.
Mm-hmm.
That and you know, my latest book is called Advanced Pistol Practice, and I've got 3 aspects of what constitutes an advanced skill. One of which is context. How do we apply this? And another one that we alluded to earlier is performance measurement. You know, because I run into people all the time and say, yeah, I have a 1 second draw. Well, how do you know? Well, I just know. Well, do you have a shot timer? No. Well, then how do you know you have 1 second draw? And in fact, you have a 3 second draw. It's not 1 second.
And then the other part of that equation is, are you just shooting into the side of a barn, or are you shooting some defined target zone?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And is it a whole IPSC target? Because I see guys post videos of their sub-second draw at a 3x4 foot piece of steel at 8 feet away. Like, that's cool, but you're hitting here and then down here and over here. Like, not really that impressed.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that having some sense, and that's why I wanted to put a measurable standard that people could understand, because I've worked with that a lot, not only in the Rogers sense of, the Rogers criterion is that you should be able to hit an 8-inch piece of steel from low ready in a half of a second. Okay, that's
distance?
7 yards.
Okay.
7 yards. So that's a good standard. But without the training system that's available at Rogers, it's hard for people to learn to do that in a short period of time. There are a lot of gifted or very practiced USPSA and IDPA shooters to whom that's not a particularly hard task. But
Mm-hmm.
at Rogers, we taught people to do that in a week, which is a little more difficult. But what we do need to be able to do is to always make some kind of performance measurement that's duplicatable and gives us an idea as ordinary people. Let's take my background as the instructor there out. As ordinary people, what do we need to be able to do? Now, there's a program that the NRA has that's called the Marksmanship Qualification Program. It's one of the NRA's, the training division's, best kept secrets, which is really unfortunate. The initial standard on their defensive pistol 1, which is oriented toward the personal protection in the home, so it's not holster work.
Mm-hmm.
But the standard for that is, hold on, I have to put my straight face on here, is to be able to put 5 shots into a 12-inch circle from low ready in 15 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay. And people look at that and go, oh, that's easy. I've run hundreds of people through that program. I teach a class on it twice a year. Hundreds of people. Only 1 person out of 10 can do that, because you have to do it to meet the NRA standard. You have to do it 4 times, not even necessarily in a row, just you have to do it 4 times. But the people who can do it on their first 4 tries, it's only 1 out of 10. And I'm not talking about new shooters. I'm talking about fairly experienced shooters that they can't meet 100% standard. They can do 18 out of the 20 shots, or maybe 19.
Throwing one and...
Yeah, that's it. They throw 1 or 2 out of maybe 1 or 2 runs, and then they're down to 16. So by giving people some kind of a measurable standard and say, maybe this is where you should start. My idea is, there's an interesting test that I included in the book called, it's from the state of Michigan, and it's their concealed carry standard.
Okay.
And you take 3 pieces of paper and stack them in landscape mode and set that at 4 yards, 12 feet, which oddly enough is that that dividing line between social space and public space. Somebody was pretty smart when they thought this drill up. And so you shoot
so you got like a 25.5 by 11-inch rectangle.
Right, exactly. Which interestingly is within 5 square inches of the FBI Q target.
Okay.
You know, it was. I looked at it
that in my head.
Yeah. So their standard is shoot 5 shots at it. Do that 3 times. 2 out of the 3 runs, all 5 shots have to hit at least all 3 pieces of paper. Somewhere on all 3 pieces of paper. Now, once again, Bill would be horrified if he heard me mention this, but that's a good place to start. Then, okay, once you can do that, but instead of doing it 2 times out of 3, make sure you can do it 3 times out of 3. When you can do it 3 times out of 3, take one of the pieces of paper away, which then oddly becomes about the size of the FBI QIT targets, which the FBI agents are qualifying on now. And when you can do that 100% of the time, then take 1 sheet of paper. And once you can do that, and start thinking about your decisions and all the other skills, the moving, accessing the gun, handling it safely, things of that nature, because that marksmanship test will probably get you through. But out of the 11 categories of negative outcomes, only 1 of them relates to marksmanship. All the others are related to decision making.
It's something I've talked about many times. I've got a fun group of friends, from dudes like you that have a high level of special operations training to got a handful of buddies that are grandmaster level shooters. And I think it's lost on the average shooter, or maybe not lost isn't a good word, but I don't know if they can fully appreciate or capture what like a current GM level shooter's capabilities are. I mean, it's like the difference between, I can't speak for you, but like I drive 70,000 miles sometimes in a year, which is ridiculous. But if you put me like in a fast car, I'd wrap it around a tree. I don't know anything about it.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
It's like the difference between a frickin' NASCAR or Formula One racer and like an average driver. I can shoot pretty darn well, and I'll go hang out with my GM buddies, and it's not even that they're that much faster. They're just their probability of not screwing stuff up and just doing it in an effortless manner. It's like you're watching a pro ball player versus high school ball players.
Well, because see, what guys like that are no longer focused on the tool. So let's go back to that, what we were talking about, focusing on the tool. They understand what the object of their exercise is, and their focus of the tool, just like you as a tradesman. To a tradesman, how to use a screwdriver, how to use a cutting knife. I was in the carpet business for a while. Things like that, they just become so second nature that you don't have to concentrate on how do I use this tool. Well, when someone buys a gun and then they put it in the drawer and they don't even handle it for a year, then they have to think about every aspect of the tool, about how does it work, and that keeps them from focusing on the circumstance. And GMs, or you can take almost anybody from, let's say, IDPA expert level, maybe a C or B class USPSA shooter, up through the highest levels of guys and gals. They're not thinking about the tool anymore. They don't have to. They know exactly how it performs, how it works, and everything. Skills. And then they're thinking about the context that they're going to use the tool in. And also, they're completely unintimidated by the performance measurement part of it. And that's another thing that people, I see them on the range all the time, that they become very, very, when I say, okay, now when I would teach a class, and I'd run through a bunch of drills and so forth, and at the end of it, I always have a test. It's a fairly simple test. For my 3-hour classes that I taught for years at indoor ranges, I I use the Los Angeles Police Department retired officers course, which is shoot. Wait a minute, I have to put my straight face on again. Shoot 10 shots at a silhouette target at 7 yards. No time limit. 7 of the 10 have to hit the target.
You can miss, huh?
You can miss 3 of them.
Just off into space.
Off into space. That level of testing is so intimidating to new gun owners. Now think about, what's your performance measurement when someone's breaking into your home?
Yeah.
You know, that's a whole level, because there your performance measurement literally could be you live or die. Your family lives or dies.
A law enforcement friend that was twice involved in a hostage scenario where a child, one time the child died, the second time that he shot the bad guy. It was a boyfriend whose girlfriend said, "You're out of here," and he took the baby and put a knife to her neck.
Mm-hmm.
And like when we've talked about that when we're working with cops, like, can you shoot a guy in the face across a room that's holding a baby? Like, do you physically have the ability to hit something that big every time, no matter what? Like, that's kind of what you're talking about. Like, what's at stake?
Yeah. What can you hit a 4-inch circle at 12 feet?
Mm-hmm.
That was the test that I used at the Mingle this year when I was teaching my class. Close range precision marksmanship is what I called it, because I had proposed sort of as a standard to the editor of an article I wrote years ago, but I put it at shoot a dude in the face, and he goes, "Let's change that to close range precision marksmanship." Okay, that's cool.
Good wordsmithing.
Yeah. But now, here's the interesting thing about it. What's the standard to the initial standard to pass the NRA Basics of Pistol Shooting class?
It's been a long time since I taught one of those. I don't even remember.
Well, the new standard is you have to be able to shoot 5 shots into a 4-inch circle at 10 feet 5 times. No time limit, or 4 times, I'm sorry. So all I did was I applied that, and I took 4-inch circles and I put faces inside the circles of notorious mass murderers, BTK killer and the Butcher of Rostov and Stalin and Hitler and
nice.
Mao and so forth. And I measured them. So people consider me sort of a ghoul for doing this, but the Army determined that the average interpupillary distance of a male is 64 millimeters.
Okay.
So I actually sized the pictures so they were, and I put a measurement on the eyes of, okay, they are 64 millimeters, 2.5 inches apart. So this is what this is going to look like, and you're going to have to shoot that guy in the face. No time limit, but you have to shoot the guy in the face. But all these things are at close range. Mm-hmm. That's the difference between us and law enforcement officers. That, for instance, in your example, a law enforcement officer might have to make that kind of a shot at a distance, or when they're responding to a mall shooter or an active shooter incident or something like that. For us as private citizens, really what we need to be doing, this is my new training philosophy, is we need to learn to shoot at the same distance that we learn to shoot that cue target, that 3 sheets of paper. We need to just keep on narrowing that down until, without hesitation, we can hit a 4-inch circle at 10 feet. And by that point, when somebody can do that, the tool, the gun, is no longer something they're thinking about consciously anymore. And it allows them more time and more mental energy to make the decisions that they need to make. And that's a problem, that we don't teach decision making to people enough. And yet that's the key factor in what they're going to do. And we have to learn to do that. We have to learn to teach them how to do that without the elaborate FATS systems and so forth that the police have the benefit of using. You know, and I don't have all that answer yet, but I'm working on it.
I couldn't agree with you more. Having well over probably 1,500 hours now, I haven't counted in a long time as a student under somebody else's course of instruction. I kind of tired with I get how to shoot, but when should I? Not that I was the one necessarily asking the question, but you'd hear it enough. And I don't know how many instructors, good guys, nice guys, learned guys, I can't tell you that. That's on you. And that's all that they had to pass on. Well, why don't we instead create some scenarios here and some thought-provoking discussions and training that people can start to sort that shit out here rather than out on the parking lot or in their bedroom. I brought up the competitive shooters in their skill because there was one other point I wanted to make on that. There are a lot of guys I know that could outshoot superheroes, except I know dudes that grew up in the city that'd take their gun away from them and shove it up their ass because they've never developed the not only the mindset or the process. They're shooting the gun because they enjoy USPSA. Doesn't mean they don't have the ability or the potential to be greatly lethal or deadly or dangerous, but I've talked to some of them. I don't even carry a gun. You know, I ace this thing up when I leave here, and yeah, I don't do that. And it's the shooting skill. I'm trying to bolster your point. Has become it's become like a hobby to train it and get really good at it and keep pushing this performance metric. And I think to myself, I would much rather talk about better dietary habits and going for more walks and getting better rest. I would rather have these discussions with a lot of my students because it will make them live longer than me teaching them to shoot faster and faster. And I teach people to shoot fast in small targets. But at the end of the day, that's not the thing.
Well, I had a great conversation with Dave Savigny years ago, and we were talking about match strategy.
And for you guys that don't know who Dave Savigny is, he's a champion shooter.
And what Dave had said was that he minimized in his stage strategy how many times he muzzled non-threat targets, because he goes, there's always a possibility you'll have an ND in between two targets, and if you ND into a non-threat, then that's a problem from the standpoint of, obviously the competition. But how different is that from, let's say if you came home and you found some bad guys in your house with your family. And actually, oddly enough, I have at least one incident in my database where there was some guy in California, came home, recognized that something was going on in his house, so got his, which is something I don't necessarily agree with, but he gets his gun out of his truck and makes entry to the house and lays waste to all the guys that are in it, menacing his family, and doesn't hurt any of his family members. And I read this and I went, good for you, dude. But we need to think about, well, is that the sort of thing that we're capable of doing? One of the drills that I have in my book is called family held hostage. And because that happens more often than we like to think. So I had posed this on a local forum, and one guy says, well, I know I can't do that, so I'm not even going to try. And I said, well, why is that? I mean, you could learn to do it. And he goes, no, I carry a judge. It's a shotgun. I know that I patterned it, and I know that I can't shoot. I can't take a hostage shot. Okay, well, at least to his credit, he knew what he was and was not capable of doing. And I'll give him credit for that. A lot of people don't even know what they are and are not capable of doing. So, that's something we need to think about in and when I say we, I'm not talking about the training community. I mean, I'm talking about we as the gun owning community, the people who are listening to this, to
The
just think
individual.
about these things ahead of time and know what you are and are not capable of doing. In Steve Harris's paradigm, the can. What can I do? Then branch up to the may. It's shocking the number of people when I do a role play in class of people who think that they can either use a gun or simply display a gun simply because I'm doing something that makes them feel uncomfortable.
Hmm.
You know, that's a big problem. The people don't understand that guns are a very limited purpose tool. Now, within their limited area of usefulness, they are clearly the best tool. But to me, I am a firm believer that if you're not carrying some kind of intermediate force option, pepper spray being the most obvious one, while you're carrying a gun, you're making a mistake. Because if you think about it, if you're not carrying an intermediate force option, what you're saying is the only thing I'm willing to do to protect myself and my family is kill someone.
No, dude. Have you seen these?
Yeah,
Huh?
yeah.
Huh? I try to
So,
flex my muscles at least every
yeah,
time.
yeah. I don't think that that's a rational statement that most people would make if they just thought about it for
Yeah,
about 10 seconds. So, well,
I
yeah, maybe
agree.
I'm not going to kill everybody.
I 100% agree. I buy Saber Red by the case, and I
Mm-hmm.
give it out. I give it out if I meet my niece's girlfriend from college. I go, come here a minute. And
Yeah,
I give her the inert bottle and the actual product. Show them how to.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
that for most, well, I shouldn't say most, but for many people, they're really better off having a can of pepper spray, good pepper spray, not
Mhm.
that crap you buy in a hardware store that,
Right.
but something like Saber Red or Fox, but I'm with you that I like Saber. Um, something like that. It's a good tool. And I'm glad to hear that you give them the inert. Here, practice this, use the inert up, and keep it, still keep the inert, because just because the stuff stops coming out of it doesn't mean you can't practice
Yeah.
getting it into your hand and learning to deploy it. And then you have a pretty useful tool, because all we have to do is force a break in contact. Even if the guy is not totally incapacitated, if he can't see me while I'm running away, sayonara, dude.
Right. 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 Right.
I'm gone, and you're going to be here orange when Officer O'Malley from the Woodstock Police Department shows up to put the bracelets on you.
Right. Right. It's a great point. I watched my bro one time juice a dude up years ago that approached our car, some stupid road rage stuff, and we had nowhere. We could not physically drive away,
Mm-hmm.
and I was armed, and this dude he kind of looked like he was like roid raging. He was just muscled up, angry, veined out, real vascular. And my brother rolls the window down and said, "Don't come over here. Don't come over here." And the guy walked up and was going to start hitting the car. And Tom just rolled the window down, and he was 3 feet away, just gave him a little, and that was quickly.
That's the end of it,
That was the end of that. Yeah. It was like, I'd never seen somebody other than in training get shot before, like, get it in their eyes. And because he had no idea it was coming when you're training, and you can muscle up and fight through it. It was quite effective.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then an hour later the guy's okay.
Yeah.
You haven't hurt him permanently, which is also an important thing for a lot of people. People are nice people. The people that you and I deal with are good people. They don't want to hurt somebody unless they absolutely have to. So when you can just say, look, apply a little bit of social lubricant to the dude, and then go away, and call the police and tell them, hey, this happened and I had to defend myself, and let them go deal with the guy. That's what they get paid for.
I think that brings up another really great question back on more like the philosophical side of things. Just because you can, should you? And I get this question, and we can go down this rabbit hole briefly if you want to. If I modify my gun and I shoot somebody, I'm going to jail. I hear this constantly, and you just kind of touched on my point. If it's the only thing you have and you have to use it, fine. If it's the only thing you have and it's the only response you have to you being uncomfortable or being approached or whatever the issue is, if it's not a justified use of force, it's not a justified use of force. Whether you've put a apex trigger in your Glock or you put some night sights on it or whatever the thing is, you have to still be justified in your actions. Kind of bringing this full circle to the like can or should I thing. Most people I know are not out looking to want to shoot people. And you're going to have some good insight on this, I think. In my studies, I found very few instances of righteous people using justified force and getting jammed up for it. I found very few instances. What do you have to say on that?
Well, they do. But what happens more often than not, that I've seen at any rate, is they get caught up in that emotional part that I alluded to with gun battles, gun battles, and they carry the use of force too far. Now
they become the punisher.
Right. And now there are some where people tend to put themselves in a bad position.
Okay, let me go back. So you described what I would say is not a justified use of force. If somebody went too far, that their actions are no longer.
Yes. Yeah.
So what I was driving at is if the person's actions were inside the context of law and what we as a society deem to be ethically and morally acceptable, usually people aren't giving a shit what is on their gun.
Where a lot of that came from is from civil law, as opposed to criminal. And that's something that is a little bit misunderstood. That in civil law, you only have to prove by a 51% by preponderance of the evidence. Criminal law, you have to prove things, beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's say 80, 90, 95%. So the strategy of those two different approaches from the part of attorneys is very different. I cannot say that I know of anybody who lost a criminal case because of a gun modification. A civil case, yes. Because a lot of things can come up in civil cases, and because the standard is much lower, well, then you can have problems. But in criminal cases, to put the may on it is it a reasonable and justifiable use of force or not? That's the issue that is going to be decided in court, not, well, you had your trigger pull was only 3.5 pounds instead of being 4. That now someone, a prosecutor might try to bring that up, especially if they have a real weak case, but that's the kind of thing that is relatively easily diffused by a criminal defense attorney to say, well, no, my client was actually trying to be safe and making sure that they got all their bullets on the target instead of having lost, having one go somewhere. That's why if you think about the 70% standard that a lot of times we talk about, that LAPD retired officer course, well, what that means is, if you think about it, that if you shoot 6 shots at somebody in your home, it's acceptable for 2 of those shots to completely miss and go into your neighbor's home. Well, if I was the neighbor, I'd be pretty unhappy about that.
Right on.
So that, a good criminal defense attorney who understands not criminals trying to get away from the law, but private citizens showing that they were justified in using the law. And that's a real different deal than, your title lawyer.
Yeah. Where
someone
I'm
can
going. Go ahead.
go ahead. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Where I'm going with that, the point I'm trying to impress on people listening or watching is be extremely justified and clear cut in your actions. Don't allow yourself. Of course, even Muhammad Ali got knocked out. Even a Green Beret can be ambushed, but don't allow yourself to be caught up in some emotional nonsense where you find yourself having to defend yourself like that. Don't use force unless it's fully justified, and use only the force commensurate with the level of predation that's presenting itself, right?
Absolutely. And have a plan for what to do. And this is the thing that I never see people do, is have a plan to do in the immediate aftermath of it. And I'm not talking about the attorney aspect of it, but rather how you deal with the police and even how you control yourself. So let's say, for instance, let's take the case of a shopkeeper who, there's a robbery and an exchange of gunfire. And then let's say that the robber then runs out the door. It is very common that people will chase. We have that predator-prey behavior, and everyone has it. No matter what they think, that is ingrained in our DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And by having a plan ahead of time, okay, if I get into a shootout with a robber and he runs out the door, I'm going to run up to the door and lock the door and lock him out, and just as important, lock myself in. So that way I don't chase him and I don't end up like that pharmacist in Oklahoma, where he chased the one guy then he allowed it. Well, and it was kind of a complex situation that he chased the one guy, couldn't find him, or lost him, whatever the case may be, came back, and then he was still so wound up in the moment that he then shot and executed the robber who had shot previously, who was on the ground. Well, if we had a plan, a tactical plan, not a legal plan, but a tactical plan for dealing with the aftermath, the immediate aftermath, as soon as you have the break in contact, what happens then? What do I do? Now, are we always going to be able to do that? Probably not. But especially, let's take the case of a storekeeper. Their rules of engagement are fairly clear. Their operational area is fairly clear, and they could pretty easily make a plan like that and say, as soon as the guy runs out the door, I'm running up to the door and I'm going to lock the door. I'm locking him out and I'm locking me in. So I can't then do anything stupid, even if I'm emotionally upset, and I'm not running down the street shooting at this guy or something like that. Or worse yet, I'm running down the street, I've got a gun, the cops pull up, and then I have to interact with the cops with my gun in my hand while I'm running down the street. That's a good way to get shot. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And once again, it's an ambiguity that law enforcement officers face when they arrive on the scene. I don't want to put myself in the midst of that ambiguity. I want it to be, somewhat controlled. So then if I lock the door as a shopkeeper, I can put my gun under the counter. When the police show up, then I got both my hands clear. I walk over, I unlock the door, and I say, "Officer, he robbed me." And then, so at that point, I haven't committed anything stupid, and I don't put the officer in the position of doing something that, even if it's justifiable, that is regrettable on both parties' part.
Back to the beginning. What's the desired end state? What's the mission? It's not to go chase criminals down the street or execute their partner in the floor of your pharmacy.
Right, exactly. It's simply to force a break in contact one way or the other. That's our. If I got no other message across to every person who is armed, and armed not necessarily doesn't mean with firearms, but firearms, knives, pepper spray, whatever. Every armed person, that your mission is to force a break in contact, either to make him go away or incapacitate him so that you can go away. If I got no other message across in that, I would consider my mission to be a success.
I dig that. I did Varg Freeborn?
Yes. I'm familiar with him. I don't know him personally, but
talking with Varg yesterday, and not to Varg said this in a recording that we did, so I'm not spilling the beans, but he was talking about, for those of you that don't know Varg, he grew up in a very violent home, family that was professional gang members. He saw people literally murdered as a young child. He himself became the focus of a murder as a kid. Somebody tried to kill him and his mother, I believe. And then later in life, he was attacked by a couple guys and had to get really violent, not to they were trying to get him in a car to take him somewhere to kill him, literally. So he stabbed a dude 23 times, ended up 5 years in prison, and had his rights restored after an appeal. And now he's got a great life. He's got a good family. He's got a good job. He teaches people about this stuff. And he told me, he said, I've been involved in shooting, stabbings. Had my ass beat. I beat some ass. And he said at about 25 years of age, somewhere around there, he decided, I don't want to do this anymore. And he said, since he decided that, he had all of these regular occurrences of violence in his life. And then he decided that he wasn't going to do that anymore or shy away from it. And he said, so 20 years have passed and he hasn't had to punch anybody, shoot anybody, stab anybody, and nobody's punched or stabbed or shot him. Just with the decision, it seems like so many people. I did a video once and it was titled, "When do I get to shoot somebody?" And from the sense of like, when do I get to do it? Like, when can I open up my presence? Because it seems like too many dudes are off looking when do I get to Second Amendment? Like it's become a verb.
And I would say, when do I get to break contact?
Yeah.
That's probably one of the great things of having been on an A team is, we regularly practice drills to break contact and, break out from encirclement, get away from the enemy, because we were almost always going to be outnumbered. So that was the whole idea. And that's probably has permeated, my thinking, as opposed to when originally I was in the 101st Airborne Division, then I went to the 1st Ranger Battalion, and then eventually I ended up in Special Forces. Well, a lot of our thinking in the community comes from, once again, that military mission of close with and destroy the enemy. And for those of us who are veterans, that's pretty well ingrained in us. And, we follow that and don't discard it at our own peril. And that's kind of where that, when do I get to shoot somebody, comes from. Whereas I think about it as, when do I get to not shoot somebody? When do I get to break in contact? And, John Murphy said, 100% of the fights that I don't get involved in, I win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true.
I like that. And once again, we'll go back to the fact that the gun is a very special purpose tool that has a very limited application in our lives. When we need it, we really need it, but we're not going to need it and shouldn't use it in a lot of circumstances when people think they should. Fortunately, most people are good people, and even though they woof about that sort of thing, they're not really going to do it, because I think at that point they know the gravitas of what they're involved in and say, well, I could shoot this guy, maybe, but it's a maybe, and I don't really want to hurt people, because I really believe that most good people don't want to hurt people. Mm-hmm. And so they, there's an internal set of controls that then kicks in that counters that woofing. But nonetheless, it concerns me, especially where it really I think will kick in is when we have a family member or a loved one. And that's why I never use the term self-defense. I always say personal protection.
Me
because
too.
because the person you're protecting may not be yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that then can bring up emotional issues that, whereas we might say ourselves, well, I can just blow that off, or I can walk away or something. But as soon as someone starts, even in the mildest way, that you perceive a threat to your children or to your wife or your husband, then people, start to lose a little bit of their clear thinking. Um, and I think there's another case where thinking about the problem ahead of time and defining what our definition of success is. Our
Mm-hmm.
definition of success is nobody gets hurt.
Yeah. There
Nobody
was
gets
just a
hurt,
case.
and I don't lose my kids' college money.
Yeah. Yeah. Just a case I just read about this morning. I think it was Texas. I could be wrong though. Guy's at some type of a party, and he's 21 years old, 22 years old. He's married. Another gentleman is aggressive with his wife. They break contact. It happens again. He goes out to his car, retrieves a shorty shotgun, and walks in and shoots the guy in the head and kills him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he's claiming it was defense of his wife because throughout the evening, this other person was accosting her, said grabbed her by the throat, but it wasn't. It sounds like, and I don't know the specifics, but reading it, it did not sound like he walked in to a guy choking his wife to death, so he shot him. It was like, you did what? I'll be right back. And he went out and came back in and shot this guy. And so he's in custody right now, but of course, claiming it was self-defense. And I don't know the specifics other than what I read in the headline. But you look at that, I'm married. I would want to club some guy to death. And I can't say sitting here that I wouldn't, at the very least, ask him what the hell happened. But to go get a weapon, walk back in and shoot somebody in the head, like, that's a pretty serious decision to make.
Yeah, as opposed to just saying, "Hey, we have to go now, dear."
Mm-hmm.
We have to go. I'm going to force a break in contact by taking you and me and putting us in our car and driving home.
Yeah. Us men, we don't want to look like, it's not chivalrous, right? I didn't defend your honor. I'm not going to just walk away. I'm not going to be Marty McFly. I'm going to beat Biff up. It was a movie reference.
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
Okay. Well, that's also for the other people too. Yeah. That's like, I like to say that, know thyself,
Mm-hmm.
not my quote at all, but if you're the kind of guy that gets so hot, you see red and can't think straight, maybe you should work on that.
Yeah.
Maybe you shouldn't even have a gun on you if you're the kind of person that makes such crummy decisions that you shoot somebody. I had a guy years ago. I was driving in a downpour, and like along the front of a shopping center, and you'd like drive 100 feet and there's a stop sign. You drive 100 feet and there's a stop sign, and it was just a cats and dogs downpour. And I had really big tires on my truck, mudder tires, and so in the rain like that, I had to drive really careful because it would have a tendency to want to hydroplane.
Okay.
And all of a sudden, a guy on a bicycle comes right out in front of me, in between stop signs. And I have to hit the brakes, and I'm going 10 or 15 miles an hour. And I just conditioned response. He rides out in front of me. I hit the horn. Boop. And this guy turns and just, blah, 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 blah. I roll the window down. I go, you freaking blankety blank. You rode out in front of me, you dumb son of a... All of a sudden, this guy, he's only 10 feet away, does a J-hook right back up to my window, pulls a little lock blade knife out and shoves it right through my window. And
Ooh.
I lean back. Now this truck's jacked up and he's on a bicycle. I lean back and his hand's like, just a few inches through the window. And I push the button, roll the window up, and I drove away. And I thought about it like, man, that was really crazy. Like, that guy just stuck a knife in here. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I was probably only 21 years old, 22 years old. And I thought, I drove about 100 feet and I turned around. I was pissed. Now I'm pissed. And I thought, what the hell am I going to do? The guy just put a knife through a stranger's window in a downpour. What am I going to do? Get out and talk to him about his bad behavior?
Right.
You know? But my immediate response was, that mother effer, I'm going to go drive over there and do something about this.
Right. And when I think anytime we get emotional, we need to think about the fact of, do I have the option at this point to just get out of here?
Yeah.
And if we do, and we can do that in complete safety, then let's take that option. That should always be our first option, to just say, if I can escape from this situation, then let's go. I put it I have a 4-word paradigm, Army background: avoid, escape, confront, and resist. So to the point that anytime I can escape from something, that's what I'm going to do, and if I don't have to confront somebody, then in most cases, I'm not then going to have to resist. And to me, when I say resist, I mean that in the physical sense, that I've got to fight or shoot or, spray the person or whatever. But if I can take those 3 options ahead of that, then those are always my best choices.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's, to confront them and just say, hey, get out of here, dude. Assuming I can do that with some measure of safety. I'm in my truck. I have the windows pretty much closed, so he can't stick the knife in. And I say, hey, get out of here, dude. And then I escape. I put my foot on the gas and off I go. Yeah. That's always our best option. And I just don't think that people always realize that. And it's not because they don't want to, it's they haven't thought about it ahead of time.
Yeah.
Thinking about things ahead of time solves a lot of problems.
I agree with that. I'm glad you touched on your 4-letter paradigm there. Yeah. That's something I think people listen to this, like some guys I know that are really into teaching the combatives aspects of what we're talking about. They say, oh, you guys are just scared to fight, or you're training people that don't have they're not sheepdogs. You're training the sheep to live. It's like, no, dude, like we're not sheepdogs. Well, sheepdogs are hired or raised by a farmer to protect a flock. My flock's right here. My wife, my kids, my little miniature dog that came in here to say hi while we've been recording. I don't have some flock out there. I'm not a sheepdog. I'm not knocking the colonel for his analogy, but I think it's been bastardized where people don't appreciate their spot in the system. But we do have to remember, just like in your acronym there, if we got to resist, do it with some vigor.
Yeah, with gusto.
Yeah, be willing to take it to whatever end you have to prevail.
Actually, right? The sheepdog analogy has an interesting real world. I'm not sure, but it has a real world connotation to it that a lot of people don't understand. A friend of mine is he's retired now, but he was a full professor of social psychology at Georgia Tech. And he went to New Zealand, where there are a lot of sheep and a lot of sheepdogs. And he was out in the country, and he came back and he said, the function of the sheepdog is not really to protect the sheep. It's to keep the sheep under control.
Ooh.
That's what the sheepdog does. The sheepdog almost, 95% of the time keeps the sheep under control. It's not really there to protect them. So I never use that analogy because I consider it sort of, insulting to our rights when people talk about being a sheepdog. Look, I don't want a sheepdog, dude. I don't want you to control me. I don't want you controlling my actions. So, when he came back and he told me that, I was like, that's a very interesting take on that whole paradigm that I don't think a lot of people realize that, that's the deal. It's not to keep they'll keep the wolves away, but 95% of the time they're keeping the sheep under control. So I don't like that paradigm at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think for most guys that adopt that moniker, and I'm not attacking it, they're thinking about, I am the protector.
Sure. I know they are. Yeah.
And I know, I'm just making sure that people listening, I know you know that, but that's not my job. When I'm at the mall, my job is not protecting the 3,000 people shopping. When I'm at the amusement park, it's not protecting the 10,000 people at Great America or Disney or wherever the heck it's at. When I'm at the movie theater, I'm not responsible for the 300 people at the show. I can't.
No. You cannot. Exactly. You can't even do it.
I tell this to cop friends of mine. Well, I have a sworn duty to protect. You're right, you do. But even I posted a video recently of 60 dudes that swarmed a Walgreens and trashed the Walgreens out in Philly. You see that on the 4th? And I posed a question to some copper buddies. So if you were there off duty, plain clothes, you're not going to stop 60 dudes. Stop in the name of the law. I've got my J-frame. Or, or you're in your uniform. Perhaps just that would have been a deterrent for some of them to turn and run. But if it wasn't, what are you going to do with 60 people? It's completely just, that's like a rabbit hole there. But to your point, thinking about it, you can't protect everybody.
Even, as you know, probably, I expect I am the only person outside of the Los Angeles Police Department, even most of them not, who has read every single one of their categorical use of force reports that they posted since 2005.
Wow.
And saved them all. There's, 1,100, something like that. And so that anytime a Los Angeles Police Department officer uses or threatens to use deadly force, that becomes what's called a categorical use of force report for them. That was it started when they were under the consent decree with the U.S. Department of Justice, and they've kept it on. It is the single most valuable source of information about police activity in the country that you can get anywhere. It's wonderful information. That also applies when they're off duty. And one of the things that runs through that, so what happens is that the officers filed reports, it's investigated by what they call the Force Investigation Division, and then the Board of Police Commissioners writes somewhere between typically a 6 and 30-page report that is posted on the internet of every single one of those incidents. And they rule on at least 3 different categories: tactics, displaying a weapon, and use of deadly force or threaten use of deadly force. But in all the off-duty incidents, one of the things they say is officers are discouraged from employing or taking enforcement action when they're off duty, unless there is a threat to the life of the public. And granted, what people think about as intervening often has aspects of a threat to the public. Let's say we were talking about with the convenience store clerk who might be shot, but people periodically do things that are just, you're stealing. There's one case where a lady in Michigan saw some guy 2 people shoplifting some stuff from Home
Depot, yeah.
And they were getting away from the security guard, so she shot at him.
I remember that one.
And so she lost her concealed carry license for, I guess, 5 years, and they let her plead down to a misdemeanor. But that's basically aggravated assault.
Yeah.
And so people need to think about the fact that even an organization like the LAPD says, look, unless somebody's life is in danger, don't do anything. Be a good witness. That's why in almost every store you go to now, they've got those markers on the doors.
Yeah.
That 4, 5, 6. So at least you can say the guy was 6 feet tall.
Yeah.
Well, look at that, and okay, the guy was 6 feet tall, or 5.5 feet, or whatever. Just be a good witness. And one of the guys in this business who was very experienced, named Evan Marshall, retired.
Great book.
Yeah, Detroit police sergeant. And many years ago, he had written an article where he said, if I get caught in a convenience store robbery, that as long as they're not doing certain things, I am just going to pretend I'm a CPA from Akron and let them go on about their business, because that's their business. Robberies are business. But he goes,
probability of it ending without him having to shoot somebody's much
right. But he said, but if they start searching people, making people get on the floor, or herding people into a back room, my wife knows to get away from me because I'm going to start shooting. And that's an example of thinking about things ahead of time and having a plan for it. So we've got our basic plan, and then our tripwire for when we're going to start employing force in some fashion. And I just thought that was a great one. And he wrote that like back in 1983. And that's just been my paradigm ever since about, well, as long as it's just the store's money, I'm not worrying about it.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing that I think has been kind of spawned by this current last 7 to 10 year explosion of more 5 years of training, that it's almost like because there's so much knowledge being pumped around, guys are looking for outlets to use it. And there's so much time spent penning articles, having discussions, talking about it in chat rooms and online of when force is justified or could or should be used, that people are not really looking at the stuff we're talking about, how to stay away from it, how to actually logically think through what is feasible, such as you talked about earlier, reloading. I don't know how many courses I've been in where we spent hours and hours and hours reloading and reloading and reloading. And I'm with you, man. I teach people how to do it mechanically. And I say, okay, so that we don't waste the next 2 days of you doing more of the bad repetitions. But
right.
Other than that, that's the last we'll talk about it, unless I see you doing something funky and I'll catch you and tell you, hold it like this, or, do something different. But
out of 5,000 incidents, I've got 4 that involved reloading.
And is that
they were
law enforcement?
No. Those are private citizens.
Okay.
5,000 private citizens, 4 examples of reloading, and those were all panic induced, where the person
What about the LEO?
Oh, that's a different story. Although in many cases there it's panic induced as well. There's an article on, I think it was like the police website or something like that, about why one officer carries 133 rounds. He's like carries 4 Glock stick magazines or something like that.
Was that Tim? Was that from my friend Tim from out here by Skokie?
I think it was Skokie. And I looked at that and I said, dude, you were on the right track, and then you completely lost the message there when you said, hey, I need to slow down and start shooting better. Not shooting more, start shooting better.
Well, you know the story with him.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So, what did he do? He slowed down and he said, well, I need to shoot the guy in the head. So I guess I'll shoot him in the head and that'll be the end of it, And I understand that when you get caught up in a circumstance like that, it affects you for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
For any of us who've been in anything like that, it affects you for the rest of your life. but I think it's also important for us to learn the right lessons from it, and to transmit the right lessons to the people who follow us.
Yeah, he's decided, like you said, in his head, I'm not going to get caught out of ammo.
Mm-hmm.
And that's stuck.
Yeah, and I can understand that on one level, but on the other level, it's like that was the wrong lesson to be derived from that incident, in my opinion.
I did a really nice podcast with him a couple years ago. It's up on our YouTube channel, and he does go he's an avid student of shooting. I've actually run into him in some courses before, so he pays on his time off and he'll go.
Good for him.
And train. But he is very much into increasing proficiency and efficiencies in his shooting and making hits count. But I think sometimes people, not you, but people, they hone in on that, those Glocks, those big 33 round sticks, and don't, get the totality of it. But yeah, I agree. Although if I got shot up like that, I probably would be walking around with a slung up AR all the time.
And I'll say I might too,
Yeah. Which, just bringing that up, that kind of, again, the context of what we're training, it's different for, like, I got a buddy, Jared Reston, that's been shot.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And he is on a full-time SWAT team that's in a pretty what's coming to my, how am I trying to he's in Jacksonville, Florida. They might be in $1 million gated community one day serving a warrant, or in the shittiest part of the hood. So they got a pretty high exposure to probable violence versus I'm just in South Dakota doing a gig, and I was with some of the local deputies out there. They've got a completely different paradigm of violence than Jared does in Florida. They're in Jacksonville.
And you can understand that. And that's part of our intelligence gathering, is not what's the worst possible case, but what's the most likely case. Let's make sure we can solve that first. And then with what remains of our training and practice time and resources, then let's start working on these worst possible cases. Although, like I say, there's different definitions for that. But I frequently see people ignoring the most likely case, which the most likely case is you need to be able to hit that piece of paper 100% of the time at 12 feet from the low ready.
What kind of time constraint?
I would like people to be able to do that under a second.
So
from the low ready, not from the holster.
So we're presuming that's this possible scenario is, hey man, don't come any closer or I'll shoot you, or drop that knife, or get the hell out of my kitchen, I've already called the cops. Some situation like that where the person has had the ability to present a weapon out in front.
Right, exactly. Where you, at that point, it's going to progress to a justifiable use of deadly force. If they can solve that in 1 second from low ready, that's a good start. That's a really good start. Bill, don't listen.
What's that?
I say, Bill Rogers, don't listen.
It's interesting. I get guys that call and they say, hey man, I want to come do some cool training. And I say, all right, like, what do you want to learn? And I've got I don't have any cool training. And what goal are you trying to solve? And I said, well, I want to be able to deal with violence. Well, that's a pretty broad freaking term, man. What is it? Are we talking about Mogadishu, or guy breaking into your garage at night looking for scrap metal to get heroin? Big variance there. And I see these dudes that have minimal proficiency in even the most basic of gun handling, and they're investing resources in vehicle combatives courses where they're shooting ARs over their partner's face through glass because it's exciting and it's fun, and there's lessons to be learned there. But dude, you can't hit that torso at 10 feet and you're investing your resources. And then I just had this conversation with somebody, like all of these, and I'm not knocking studying vehicle courses or something like that, but the context is kind of so slim for the average dude. Like, if you're not a cop, you drive around with an AR between your legs as a passenger of a freaking car very often.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm going to go with no. And even if you are a cop, where's your AR? For the most of the guys, it's in their trunk in a bag. You know, like, it's just such a low probability. I don't know if it has efficacy for training for average Joes.
I'll go back to, I think, until people can execute certain basic tasks flawlessly, they should just keep at that, even though it's repetitious and boring. You know, years ago, I was talking with a friend of mine who's a master class shooter, and somebody said, yeah, it's just, you know, doing that stuff is boring. And Mike said, how do you think I got to be a master class shooter? I just did the same boring standards drill over and over and over again until I didn't have to think about it anymore, and it would just happen.
Mastery of the basics.
That's it, you know. And then, so, you know, when you take mastery of the basics and overlay it on, you know, that context and the performance measurement aspect of it, then you've got the recipe for success. And that's, I try to set myself up for success. I try to set my students up for success, my clients, and I would like for everybody to look at how can they set themselves up for success. And until you can do things at a very automatic level, you know, automaticity, as they call it, you know, muscle, I hate that term, muscle memory, because that's not the way they refer to it in psychology. It's automaticity. So when you have a high level of automaticity, then you can start going out and doing the cool stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm no different than anybody else. That I like that stuff too. It's fun. It's, you know, it's entertaining. It it alleviates the crushing boredom that many times we have in our lives. But I don't confuse that with being the most likely case of what I need to know.
I like that. Yeah, that makes good sense. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, Claude. We've been talking 2 hours and 21 minutes, brother.
Wow.
That's a long time. You're an easy guy to talk to. And I apologize. I talked quite a bit myself. We were here to talk to you, but.
No, that's cool. I like having an interchange of ideas, you know, because we all see different things as we're doing training. And I think that's worthwhile that, you know, we have a back and forth. I'm not the kind of person who has to feel like I am running my lips all the time. So no,
you're a good conversationalist. We had a nice talk on the phone a couple of weeks ago, and glad that we got this done. We could have a chat like this every month because you've got so much knowledge, but really you want people buying your books.
That's right.
Showing up at your classes. How do people find you?
If they go to my website, tacticalprofessor.com, Tactical Professor, all one word.
We'll put a link up.
They will see all the various musings that I make, and on the upper left-hand corner, there's a pull-down menu called Tactical Professor Books, and the links to all of my published material is on that. So it's pretty easy to find.
I dig it. You got an Instagram account?
I do.
Tactical Professor, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I believe you're on Facebook as well.
Yes. You know, my personal, and then there's Claude Werner, the Tactical Professor, is where I post the gun-related stuff.
It's good stuff. I appreciate you taking the time. You've passed on a lot of good knowledge, and I appreciate your service, the amount of energy that you put into compiling all of this data. It's fantastic. So I look forward to having you on again in the future. And if you've got any parting words, please.
I enjoyed it. Yeah. Well, let's definitely do it again.
Thank you. The rest of you guys that are listening or watching, thank you for your time, your energy. Do us a favor. You know, we do this stuff. We like it. We enjoy it. It's our work. But we also, as Claude said several times, he wants you to take this stuff away. So pass it on. Take the video that you're watching here or the audio that you're listening to and forward it to your friends. There's some selfishness in that. I want you to pass this on so more people see it. But we're not doing it for no reason. It's that we want people to begin training and becoming safer, not just getting better at shooting holes in paper or dinging steel, which is cool.
And we want to set them up for success.
Amen.
I'm a big believer in that. I try to set myself up for success. I try to set my friends up for success. And anybody that watches this podcast, I want them to set themselves up for success. Think about what we talked about.
I think that's a great way to end it. You guys be well. Claude, you have a fantastic evening, sir.
I will. Thanks. You too.
Bye now. Visit our website, CarryTrainer.com, for information about classes held throughout the U.S., CarryTrainer apparel, and upcoming projects. You can also email us at training@CarryTrainer.com for information about setting up your own private course or speaking engagement. Training@CarryTrainer.com or CarryTrainer.com.